A little homeless girl approaches Johnny Depp for help, and then he notices something significant, leading him to take immediate action. Amidst the towering glass skyscrapers of downtown, Johnny Depp stepped out from the grand entrance of an opulent hotel. The atmosphere buzzed with the usual urban symphony, distant car horns blaring, the hum of conversations from passers-by, and the faint rumble of construction reverberating from a few blocks away. Johnny, adorned in his signature eclectic attire with sunglasses perched on his nose, strode toward a sleek black limousine waiting at the curb. His chauffeur, a tall man in his 50s named Thomas, stood poised beside the vehicle. With practiced precision, Thomas opened the rear door as Johnny neared. "Good morning, Mr. Depp," Thomas greeted with a courteous nod. "Hope you had a pleasant stay." Johnny offered a warm smile in return. "Morning, Thomas. It was fine, thanks. But I'm ready to head home now, though we've got one last stop for a photo shoot first." Just as Johnny was about to slide into the plush leather seats of the limo, a small figure suddenly darted past him with surprising swiftness. Before he could fully process what was happening, he felt a small pair of hands latch onto his leg. Looking down, he saw a little girl, completely bald, clutching him tightly. Her body trembled, and her gaze remained locked on something in the distance, never meeting his eyes. Caught off guard, Johnny gently placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "Hey there," he said softly, trying to make eye contact. "Are you okay?" Before the child could respond, an angry voice cut through the air like a knife. Startled, the girl's grip on Johnny's leg tightened momentarily before she abruptly let go and vanished into the sea of pedestrians without saying a word. A red-faced man in his 40s, wearing an apron with the logo of a nearby convenience store, approached Johnny. His eyes followed the direction where the girl had fled, seemingly oblivious to whom he was addressing. "That little troublemaker," the man barked, his words dripping with bitterness. "She's always hanging around my store, scaring off customers. Brings nothing but bad luck, I tell you." Johnny arched an eyebrow, his expression a blend of concern and curiosity. "Has she actually done anything wrong? Stolen something?" he asked, his tone calm but edged with subtle challenge. The store owner, too caught up in his own tirade, replied, "No, not exactly. She doesn't steal, but she's always wandering through the aisles, touching everything, never buying, just lingering. It's unsettling. My regulars don't like it, and neither do I. I'm sure she's up to something, just biding her time. Until I drop my guard, and then she'll swipe something," the man huffed, cutting himself off mid-sentence. His eyes suddenly landed on Johnny, and recognition washed over his face. The anger that had consumed him moments ago melted away, replaced by a mix of embarrassment and awe. "Oh my God," he stammered, his cheeks flushing a deeper red. You're Johnny Depp. I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't realize. I didn't mean to." Johnny raised a hand, cutting off the man's flustered apologies. "It's fine," he said calmly. "But let me ask you again. Has that girl ever actually stolen or damaged anything in your store?" The store owner hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. His gaze flicked nervously between Johnny and the direction the girl had fled. "Well, no," he admitted grudgingly. "But she's always hanging around. It's just not right." Johnny nodded thoughtfully, his expression calm but reflective. "You know," he said, his voice soft, almost meditative, "I've learned over the years that judging someone for things they haven't done can be a mistake. Maybe there's more to her story than you realize." With that, Johnny turned and stepped into the waiting limousine. Thomas quietly closed the door, muffling the sound of the store owner's muttered retort. "I don't like you celebrities anyway," the man grumbled under his breath. "Never care about what's really going on in the world." As the limousine eased away from the curb, Johnny settled back in his seat. Yet, his thoughts lingered on the peculiar encounter, the fear in the girl's eyes, the bitterness in the store owner's voice. The imagery stuck with him as the cityscape began to blur outside the tinted windows. As the vehicle merged into the slow-moving traffic, Johnny leaned forward, his voice carrying a note of urgency. "Thomas," he said, "could you slow down a bit? I want to keep an eye out for something." Thomas adjusted the limo's pace immediately. "Of course, Mr. Depp. Is everything all right?" Johnny's sharp eyes scanned the sidewalks and streets beyond the glass, a determined expression on his face. "I'm not sure," he murmured, his brow furrowed. "There was a child back there. I need to make sure she's okay. She's bald, looks around 9 or 10 years old. Help me find her," Johnny urged. "Of course, sir," Thomas replied without hesitation, his tone steady and reassuring. The city unfolded outside the limousine at a more deliberate pace, bustling sidewalks crowded with commuters, street vendors setting up their carts, and groups of tourists already wandering the urban maze. Johnny's eyes scanned every face, darting from person to person, searching for the small, bald head among the throng. Just as his hope began to waver, a familiar figure caught his eye, a small girl huddled against the wall of a convenience store on the next block. "Thomas," Johnny called urgently, "pull over here, please." The limousine glided to a smooth stop, and Johnny stepped out onto the sidewalk, his iconic sunglasses shielding his gaze. Approaching the girl slowly, he moved with deliberate care, not wanting to alarm her. She sat on the pavement, holding a small paper cup in her lap for donations. Her posture, slumped and weary, spoke of defeat, but when Johnny drew closer, her eyes lit up with recognition. Johnny crouched to her level, offering a warm smile. "Hello again," he said gently, his voice soft but kind. He reached into his wallet and pulled out several large bills, placing them carefully into her cup. The girl's eyes widened in disbelief at the generous gesture. Suddenly she sprang forward, wrapping her small arms tightly around Johnny's leg. This time, the embrace wasn't born of fear but pure, unfiltered joy. "Thank you," she cried, her voice muffled against the fabric of his pants. She pulled back slightly, her eyes brimming with wonder as she looked up at him. "Are you Captain Jack Sparrow? Where's your ship?" Johnny couldn't help but laugh, the girl's innocent excitement melting away the weight of the moment. Despite her situation, her enthusiasm was infectious. Slipping seamlessly into his Jack Sparrow persona, Johnny replied with a playful grin. "Ah, well, love, the Black Pearl is safely anchored in a secret cove, waiting for her next great adventure." "But tell me," Johnny said, his voice taking on a playful yet caring tone, "what's a brave little pirate like yourself doing out here all alone?" The girl's smile faltered, and her gaze shifted nervously to her surroundings before settling back on Johnny. "Captain Jack Sparrow," she whispered, her voice trembling with urgency. "Please, help me." Johnny instinctively reached for his wallet again, but the girl quickly shook her head, her expression earnest. "Not money," she said firmly, her wide eyes filled with desperation. "I need—" Before she could finish her sentence, a small crowd began to gather around them. Fans, recognizing Johnny, moved in with phones raised, calling out his name and pleading for selfies. Murmurs rippled through the group as they speculated about why the famous actor was speaking with a homeless girl. The girl recoiled, her small frame shrinking as the growing attention overwhelmed her. The crowd jostled closer, some unintentionally bumping into Johnny as they tried to get his attention. Johnny stepped back instinctively, his calm demeanor intact as he assessed the situation. Thomas, ever vigilant, quickly stepped forward. "All right, folks, give him some space," he commanded, his authoritative tone cutting through the commotion. Guiding Johnny with a firm yet gentle hand on his shoulder, Thomas opened the limousine door and ushered him inside with practiced efficiency. Once inside, Johnny's gaze darted to the window, his expression clouded with worry as he searched for the girl amidst the chaos. She was gone, swallowed by the crowd. "Mr. Depp, I'm sorry, but we need to leave," Thomas said, his voice polite but firm. "Your schedule." Johnny didn't respond, his focus still locked on the scene outside. After a long pause, he finally turned away from the window, his expression distant and deeply troubled. "And preoccupied." Johnny's voice was unusually soft as he murmured to Thomas. "Yeah, I heard you," he added, his eyes flicking back to the bustling street for a fleeting moment. Straightening in his seat, he whispered under his breath, "I'll be back," a quiet promise meant for the girl. Thomas, sensing the shift, signaled the driver to merge back into traffic. As the limousine resumed its journey, Johnny's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He answered to hear the familiar voice of an event organizer confirming his attendance at the upcoming magazine photo shoot. "Yes, everything's on schedule." "I'm on my way," Johnny said, his tone composed, though his mind was still on the little girl he had left behind. Ending the call, he turned to Thomas with a determined expression. "We've got a few minutes to spare, right?" Thomas checked his watch and nodded. "About 5 minutes, sir, if we're to stay on track for your appointment." "Then let's go back," Johnny said firmly. "There's something I need to do." The limousine smoothly turned, retracing their path through the city streets with practiced precision. Johnny's eyes stayed glued to the passing scenery, searching intently for any trace of the child. But as they neared the spot where he'd last seen her, his heart sank. The crowd had dispersed, and the girl was nowhere to be found. "Pull over here, Thomas," Johnny instructed. The car came to a halt by the convenience store. Johnny stepped out, turning to his chauffeur. "I'm just going to take a quick look inside. I won't be long." The bell above the door jingled softly as Johnny entered. The fluorescent lights cast a stark glow over the aisles, their hum blending with a distant whir of refrigeration units. Behind the counter, a teenage cashier was absorbed in a mobile game, barely acknowledging Johnny's presence. Johnny moved quietly through the store, scanning each aisle with focused precision. His sharp eyes searched for any hint of movement, any sign of the small figure from earlier. The store was silent save for the beeping of the cashier's game. After combing through the aisles and finding no sign of the girl, Johnny approached the counter. The cashier finally glanced up, his eyes widening as he recognized the famous figure before him. "Excuse me," Johnny began politely, "I'm looking for a little girl, bald, about this tall." He gestured to indicate her height. "Have you seen anyone like that recently?" The cashier blinked, his expression blank. "Nah, man, haven't seen any kids today," he replied with a shrug before returning to his game. Johnny sighed, disappointment flickering across his face. "Thanks," he said simply before stepping back outside. The afternoon sun bore down as he scanned the nearby sidewalks and alleys, taking several steps in either direction. Time was slipping away, and he knew the longer he stayed, the greater the risk of being recognized again. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the girl needed his help. After a few more minutes of fruitless searching, Johnny reluctantly returned to the waiting limousine. Settling into the back seat, he pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his calendar. The list of appointments stretched endlessly before him, a stark reminder of the unrelenting demands of his career. Thomas started the engine, ready to resume their journey to the photo shoot. As the limousine rolled onward, Johnny remained lost in thought. "Maybe she's gone for good," he muttered, the quiet hum of the engine filling the space. Suddenly, a soft knock on the window jolted him from his reverie. The stillness in the car was interrupted as Johnny turned his head, blinking in surprise. Pressed against the glass was a small, familiar face. Tiny hands cupped around her eyes as she peered intently into the tinted window. Johnny's heart leapt, The bald head and wide eyes made it unmistakable. It was her. The limousine had stopped at a traffic light. Johnny's gaze flicked to the traffic signal countdown, which showed just a few seconds left before the light would turn green. Without wasting a moment, Johnny reached for the door handle, determination flashing in his eyes. He was determined to learn more, to understand her plea for help. "Come on," he urged the girl urgently, making a quick decision. With a fluid motion, he opened the door and gently helped her into the back seat just as the light shifted. The soft creak of the leather seats filled the car as she settled next to him, her small frame looking even more delicate against the luxurious surroundings. Thomas, ever attentive, glanced into the rear-view mirror. His eyebrows lifted in mild surprise, but he kept quiet, smoothly accelerating as the car moved forward. Inside the cool, climate-controlled interior of the limousine, the girl visibly relaxed. Her wide eyes darted around, taking in the plush environment, a stark contrast to the harsh streets she'd just left behind. Johnny watched her closely. He noticed how her small hands absent-mindedly rubbed her arms, as if trying to warm herself, despite the comfortable temperature in the vehicle. "What's your name?" Johnny asked softly, his tone warm and inviting. The girl hesitated briefly before responding in a quiet voice. "Sonia." Johnny smiled warmly. "It's nice to meet you properly, Sonia," he said. "Now, can you tell me what kind of help you need?" Rather than answering with words, Sonia raised a trembling hand and pointed through the window. Johnny followed her gesture, his eyes landing on an old, somewhat run-down building. A large sign on the front read orphanage, though it was partially faded. Before Johnny could ask what it meant, Sonia's hands moved again. This time, the gesture was personal and heartbreaking. She lightly touched her bald head, her expression deeply pained. Sonia then lifted her sleeve, revealing a dark and concerning mark on her arm. "Please help, sir," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. The plea carried a newfound gravity, and Johnny felt a knot tighten in his stomach as the pieces began falling into place. Leaning closer, Johnny carefully examined the mark on Sonia's arm. His expression grew somber as realization dawned. The combination of her bald head, pale complexion, and the troubling mark painted a heartbreaking picture of her condition. "Sonia," Johnny began softly, his voice heavy with concern, "are you sick? Is that why you're asking for help?" The little girl nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "The doctors at the orphanage said I need special medicine," she explained, her voice faltering. "But they don't have enough money. I've been trying to save up." She gestured toward the few meager belongings in her lap, her voice trailing off in helplessness. The weight of her words settled heavily in the car, the air thick with emotion. Without hesitation, Johnny turned to Thomas. "Can you find a spot to park near the orphanage we just passed? We need to talk to someone there." "Of course, Mr. Depp," Thomas replied, already adjusting their route to circle back. As the limousine approached the orphanage, Johnny noticed Sonia's demeanor shift. She seemed to shrink into herself, her earlier courage giving way to apprehension. "It's going to be okay," Johnny reassured her, his voice steady and comforting as he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out together, all right?" Sonia managed a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. When the car came to a stop in front of the orphanage, Johnny helped Sonia out. As they neared the entrance, her steps grew hesitant, each one slower than the last. The short staircase leading to the front door loomed before her like an insurmountable obstacle. Just as they reached the bottom step, Sonia's legs gave out. Johnny instinctively reached out, catching her as she began to fall. Though his grip slowed her descent, she still tumbled the last few steps, her small frame hitting the pavement below with a painful thud. "Sonia!" Johnny cried, rushing to her side. gently cradling her head. He was relieved to see her eyes flutter open, but alarmed by the small trickle of blood from a cut on her forehead. Wasting no time, Johnny pulled out his phone and called emergency services. As he explained the situation to the operator, his free hand rested protectively on Sonia's shoulder, offering whatever comfort he could. She was conscious. Surely that was a good sign? Yet his mind raced with worry. Could she have broken a bone? Was there more damage than he could see? The harsh afternoon sun cast deep shadows across Sonia's pale face, accentuating the fear and pain etched in her features. Johnny's heart pounded as he waited for the ambulance, his concern for the fragile little girl growing with each passing moment. Just as he ended the call, the front door of the orphanage flew open. An elderly woman with neatly tied silver hair hurried out, her face etched with worry. "Oh, dear Lord!" she exclaimed, her voice trembling as she descended the stairs as quickly as her age would allow. "What happened? Is she all right?" Johnny glanced up, his hand still resting gently on Sonia's shoulder. "She collapsed on the stairs," he explained quickly, his tone urgent but steady. "To the hospital after she collapsed at the orphanage. I just want to make sure she's okay." The nurse gave him a kind but cautious look. "She'll be in good hands, sir. The doctor will come speak with you once they've finished the initial examination." Johnny nodded, stepping away from the station. He paced the waiting area, his thoughts restless. His mind replayed the events of the day, the girl's plea, her frailty, the courage she showed despite everything. He couldn't help but feel a growing sense of responsibility for her well-being. Thomas appeared a moment later, having parked the limousine. "Any news, sir?" he asked, his voice low. "Not yet," Johnny replied, glancing toward the curtained area. "She's with the doctor now." Before he could say more, the curtains shifted, and Miss Abigail emerged, her face pale but steady. She approached Johnny with a tired smile. "She's stable for now," she said. "The doctors are running tests to see if there's any immediate cause for concern, but she'll need proper treatment and long-term care. It's been a challenge providing everything she needs." Johnny's gaze softened as he studied the woman. It was clear that she deeply cared for the children under her care, but the weight of her responsibilities was evident in the lines of her face and the sadness in her eyes. "Miss Abigail," he began, his voice firm but kind, "what do you need?" "For Sonia and for the orphanage. I want to help." Miss Abigail blinked, taken aback by the question. "Mr. Depp, I appreciate the thought, truly, but—" "No buts," Johnny interrupted gently. "Tell me what Sonia needs. Treatment, medicine, resources. Whatever it takes." Her lips trembled as she fought back tears. "The treatments are expensive. We've been relying on donations, but it's never enough. Sonia needs chemotherapy and specialized care. And the orphanage? Well, we're struggling to keep the lights on some months." Johnny placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You won't have to do it alone anymore. I'll cover Sonia's treatments and make sure the orphanage has what it needs." Miss Abigail's eyes widened, her composure breaking as tears spilled down her cheeks. I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You don't have to," Johnny replied with a warm smile. "Just promise me you'll keep fighting for those kids, and let me know if you ever need anything else." As they spoke, a doctor approached, clipboard in hand. "Miss Abigail?" "Mr. Depp." He addressed them both. "Sonia's stable, but she'll need to stay overnight for observation. Her condition is delicate, but with the right care, she can have a fighting chance." "Thank you, Doctor," Johnny said, relief flooding his expression. Miss Abigail nodded, then glanced at Johnny with gratitude. "I'll stay with her tonight." Johnny nodded. "I'll check in tomorrow." and I'll make arrangements for the treatment." As the night deepened, Johnny left the hospital with a renewed sense of purpose. The little girl with the brave smile had touched his heart, and he was determined to make a difference, not just for her, but for all the children at the orphanage. Miss Abigail continued, her voice growing steadier as she spoke about her life's work. Hope's Haven started as a dream, a safe space for children who had nowhere else to go. Over the years, we've cared for hundreds of children, but the past decade has been difficult. Funding is scarce, and resources are stretched thin. We rely mostly on donations and grants, but those have been declining. She gestured toward the curtained area where Sonia lay. Children like Sonia, with complex medical needs, require more than we can provide. We do what we can, but it's never enough. Johnny listened intently, his brow furrowed. The weight of Miss Abigail's words painted a vivid picture of the challenges Hope's Haven faced daily. "How many children live there now?" Johnny asked. "Currently, we have 24, she replied, each with their own struggles. Some have physical illnesses, others face emotional scars from the lives they've left behind. It's a constant battle to keep the lights on, to provide food, education, and a sense of security." Johnny nodded, his mind already turning over possibilities. "Miss Abigail, you've dedicated your life to these kids, but you shouldn't have to do it alone. I'd like to help, not just Sonia, but the entire orphanage." Miss Abigail's eyes widened. "Mr. Depp, that's— I don't even know what to say." "Then don't say anything yet," Johnny replied with a warm smile. "Let's start with Sonia. Once she's on the path to recovery, we'll figure out how to make sure Hope's Haven has everything it needs to keep going and thriving." Before Miss Abigail could respond, a doctor emerged from behind the curtain. "Miss Abigail?" "Mr. Depp," the doctor said, addressing them both. "Sonia's tests have confirmed her condition is serious but treatable. She'll need immediate chemotherapy to stabilize her and give her a fighting chance." Johnny stepped forward. "Start whatever treatments are necessary. I'll handle the costs." The doctor hesitated, clearly recognizing the man before him. "Are you sure? This will be a long process, and it's not." "I'm sure," Johnny interrupted. "Just take care of her." The doctor nodded, relief evident in his expression. "We'll admit her right away and get started." "Thank you, Mr. Depp." As the doctor walked away, Miss Abigail turned to Johnny, her eyes brimming with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you. You've changed Sonia's life, and ours." Johnny shook his head. "You've already done so much for her and the other children. Let me take some of that burden off your shoulders." As the hospital staff moved quickly to admit Sonia, Johnny and Miss Abigail settled into the waiting area. Their conversation turned to plans for Hope's Haven, with Johnny suggesting ways to raise awareness and secure long-term funding. For the first time in years, Miss Abigail felt a glimmer of hope, not just for Sonia, but for all the children who called Hope's Haven their home. And as Johnny sat beside her, his mind buzzing with ideas, he realized that his encounter with a brave little girl on the streets had not only changed her life, but had profoundly altered his own. A small gesture, but one that could bring a bit of comfort to Sonia during such a harrowing time. Johnny had a sudden idea. He quickly retraced his steps back to the waiting area and motioned for Miss Abigail to join him. She stood up immediately, looking both curious and a little apprehensive. "I have something for Sonia," Johnny said, his eyes brightening with a mix of determination and excitement. "Something to make her smile. I'll be right back." Before Miss Abigail could say anything, Johnny turned on his heel and headed back toward the limousine. He returned a few minutes later with a small bag in hand, his eyes fixed on the hospital entrance ahead. Miss Abigail raised an eyebrow as she saw the bag, and then her face softened. "What is it, Mr. Depp?" Johnny smiled as he held up the small bag. "I've got a few little surprises for Sonia. You said she loves the movie, right?" Miss Abigail nodded in confusion, still unsure of what he meant. Johnny opened the bag to reveal a couple of branded Pirates of the Caribbean trinkets, a soft, pirate-themed plush toy, and a small replica of Captain Jack Sparrow's compass. He held them up. "I thought these might bring a little comfort to her. If she's a fan of the movies, maybe it'll distract her for a bit and remind her that she's not alone." A soft chuckle escaped Miss Abigail's lips, and she wiped away a tear that had escaped her. "I think she'd love that more than anything right now." Johnny handed her the items. "Go ahead. Give them to her." Miss Abigail hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, visibly touched by Johnny's gesture. She walked toward the ER curtain, where the nurse had reappeared to inform Johnny that they were finishing up the CT scan. As Miss Abigail went inside, Johnny took a seat again, feeling the weight of the moment. His mind was still turning over the future of the orphanage. His promise to Miss Abigail and to Sonia was no small thing. He glanced down at his phone, his thoughts momentarily interrupted by a notification. It was a reminder about the photo shoot that had been scheduled earlier. But Johnny didn't care about that now. His eyes turned back to the curtained area, his thoughts focused on Sonia, on Hope's Haven, and the future he would help shape for both. With the arrangements made, Johnny turned his attention back to Miss Abigail, who was still processing the weight of the doctor's words. Her face was a mask of concern, and her hands wrung nervously together in front of her. Johnny placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're going to make sure Sonia gets through this," he said quietly, his voice full of determination. "She's in good hands here, and I'll be here every step of the way. You're not alone in this anymore, Miss Abigail." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and relief. "Thank you, Mr. Depp," she whispered, her voice shaky but sincere. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Johnny gave a small smile, the weight of the situation still heavy on him, but now there was a sense of purpose behind his actions. "We'll take care of everything, one step at a time. First, let's make sure Sonia has something to keep her spirits up. I have a few surprises for her." Miss Abigail raised an eyebrow in confusion, but followed Johnny as he reached into the bag he'd brought with him. He pulled out the golden pirate coin trinket, the Jack Sparrow hat, and the DVD of Pirates of the Caribbean. "I thought this might bring her a little joy," Johnny said, his voice light with an effort to bring some levity to the situation. "A little pirate magic never hurt anyone." Miss Abigail's lips quivered into a small smile. "You're a kind man, Mr. Depp," she said softly. Johnny gave her a wink. "Just trying to make sure she has something to smile about." As they approached Sonia's room, Johnny's heart tightened. He wasn't sure what kind of state she'd be in, after everything she had endured. When they entered, Sonia lay in bed, her small form surrounded by the sterile white of the hospital room. Her face was pale, but she managed to lift her head as they entered. Johnny's eyes softened at the sight of her, and he walked over, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Hey, kiddo," he said gently, his voice low. "How you feeling?" Sonia's eyes widened a bit when she saw Johnny, and her lips parted, but she seemed too weak to say anything. She gave a small, tired smile. Johnny reached into the bag and pulled out the items. "I thought you might like these," he said, holding out the Jack Sparrow hat. "A little pirate magic, just for you." Sonia's eyes lit up in a way that was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. She weakly reached for the hat, her fingers trembling as she pulled it close. You got this for me," she whispered, a spark of joy in her voice despite her exhaustion. Johnny smiled warmly. "Of course I did. You're a brave little pirate, Sonia. Now, you can wear the hat and feel like you're ready for any adventure." He placed the hat on her head, and for a moment it seemed like the weight of the world had momentarily lifted from her small shoulders. She grinned, her face lighting up, and she giggled softly. "Thank you," she murmured, clutching the golden coin in her hand like a treasure. Miss Abigail stood in the doorway, her eyes brimming with tears as she watched the scene. Johnny caught her gaze and nodded, a silent acknowledgment of the promise he had made to both of them. As the hours passed, Sonia's spirits seemed to lift, albeit just a little. With every small gesture, Johnny was determined to keep her hope alive. He knew the road ahead would be long, but with the team of doctors and his support, Sonia had a chance, and he wasn't going to let her face it alone. Later that evening, as Johnny prepared to leave for the night, he looked over at Miss Abigail one last time. "I'll be back tomorrow. Keep me posted on how she's doing, okay?" Miss Abigail nodded, her voice filled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you again, Mr. Depp, for everything." Johnny smiled, his heart heavy but filled with resolve. "It's the least I can do. I'll see you both tomorrow." As he left the hospital, he glanced back at the lights of the building, his mind already racing with thoughts of what more he could do. But for tonight, he had done what he could. And for Sonia, that would have to be enough. To lift her spirits further. "You know," Johnny said, his voice filled with a hint of mischief, "on set, we used to do our own stunts. There was one time when I had to jump from one ship to another. The only problem was, the ship wasn't exactly where it was supposed to be. So, instead of landing on the deck, I landed right in the water." Sonia's eyes widened, and she giggled. "Did you get hurt?" Johnny grinned. "Not at all. Well, not much anyway," he added with a wink. "But it was a bit embarrassing. And don't even get me started on the time I had to wear that ridiculously large hat for hours in the hot sun. It kept blowing off, and I'd have to run after it every time the wind caught it." Sonia laughed, her fear from earlier forgotten, her face lighting up with a joy that Johnny hadn't seen before. "That sounds like something Captain Sparrow would do." "Exactly," Johnny replied, giving her a playful salute. "Because Captain Jack Sparrow never lets a little wind stop him. He just keeps going. Adventure waits for no one." Miss Abigail watched them from the doorway, her eyes misting over at the scene. She had never seen Sonia so animated, so full of life. In this fleeting moment, Johnny had managed to turn what could have been a fearful night into something memorable. As the movie continued, Johnny turned to Miss Abigail, his voice lowering so Sonia wouldn't hear. "We'll make sure the orphanage gets the help it needs," he said quietly. "Sonia shouldn't have to struggle like that. No child should." Miss Abigail nodded, her lips trembling as she tried to hold back the tears. "Thank you, Mr. Depp. You have no idea how much this means." Johnny gave her a small but resolute smile. "We'll make a difference. One step at a time." The night wore on, and despite the looming surgery, the mood in the room had shifted. Sonia's giggles filled the air, a stark contrast to the uncertainty they had all felt earlier. As the movie reached its climax, Johnny leaned back in his chair, watching Sonia with a sense of quiet satisfaction. She was safe for now, and that was the most important thing. Eventually, as the movie ended, Sonia yawned and rubbed her eyes, her energy beginning to fade. Johnny stood up, preparing to leave for the night. "All right, little pirate," he said softly, "it's time to rest now. Tomorrow's a big day, and we'll need you to be strong for the adventure ahead." Sonia nodded sleepily, clutching the golden coin in her hand. "I'll be brave," she whispered, her voice drowsy but resolute. Johnny smiled, bending down to place a gentle kiss on the top of her head, his heart full of hope. "I know you will, Sonia. Sleep well. Tomorrow, We start a new chapter. As he walked to the door, Miss Abigail caught his eye. "Thank you again, Mr. Depp, for everything," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Johnny gave her a simple nod, his expression sincere. "We're all in this together." With that, he left the room, his mind focused on what the next day would bring. Tomorrow, they would fight this battle, and Johnny would be there every step of the way, doing whatever it took to give Sonia the future she deserved. The tension in the waiting area hung heavy as the minutes ticked by, both Johnny and Miss Abigail anxiously watching the indicator light above the operating room door. It was hard for either of them to focus on anything other than Sonia and the surgery that could change her life. Johnny leaned back in his chair, glancing at the screen of his phone for a moment before silencing it. He had hoped he could temporarily escape the pull of his career, but the reality of the world outside the hospital was a constant pressure. Yet, in this moment, it felt irrelevant. His mind was firmly focused on Sonia, and the promise he had made to help her. Miss Abigail, sensing the quiet conflict in Johnny, spoke again, her voice soft. "I don't know how to thank you enough, Mr. Depp. You've already done so much for us, for Sonia. You've given us a chance to hold on to hope." Johnny smiled gently at her. "You don't need to thank me, Miss Abigail. I'm doing what anyone would do in my position. Sonia deserves this. She deserves a chance, just like every child does." The silence between them was comforting, and yet neither of them could help but feel the weight of the waiting. It felt as though time itself had slowed, the sterile environment of the hospital room emphasizing how uncertain everything was. Johnny's thoughts wandered to his childhood, to moments where he'd experienced fear, courage, and the desire to escape into a world of adventure, just like Sonia had with her pirate dreams. But this was different. This wasn't a make-believe world. This was real. And in this world, they were fighting for Sonia's future. Minutes stretched into hours, the tension mounting with every passing second. Then, just as Johnny was beginning to feel the exhaustion creeping up on him, a nurse came into the waiting room, her expression calm but serious. "Mr. Depp, Miss Abigail," she said, her voice reassuring, "Sonia is out of surgery. Everything went well. The doctors will be in shortly to discuss her recovery." The relief that washed over Johnny was palpable. He stood up, his legs stiff from hours of sitting, and looked at Miss Abigail, his heart lighter than it had been in hours. "She made it through," he said quietly, almost to himself. "She's going to be okay." Miss Abigail wiped a tear from her eye, her voice filled with gratitude. "I can't believe it. I didn't know if I could handle losing her. She means everything to me." Johnny placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "She's strong, Miss Abigail, and now she has even more people rooting for her." The minutes ticked by before Dr. Marvey entered, his expression a mix of professionalism and warmth. "Sonia is stable. The surgery went as planned. We were able to remove the tumor and affected lymph nodes, but it's still early. We'll need to monitor her closely, but we're hopeful." Johnny felt a wave of relief flood over him, but there was still much more to be done. "How long will her recovery take?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with concern. "She'll need some time to recover, of course," Dr. Marvey replied. "We'll monitor her for any complications in the next few days, but we're optimistic. Once she's strong enough, we'll begin a treatment plan to prevent the cancer from returning." Johnny nodded, absorbing the information, but his thoughts returned to Sonia. He couldn't wait to see her again, to tell her that the adventure wasn't over yet. He would be there for her every step of the way, just as he had promised. As the doctor left, Miss Abigail turned to Johnny, her face full of emotion. "Thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for everything. I don't know what we would have done without you." Johnny gave her a soft smile. It's not over yet. We've got a long road ahead, but we'll get through it together." He stood up, a quiet determination settling over him. "Let's go check on Sonia." As they made their way down the sterile hospital corridor, Johnny couldn't help but think about how much of an impact these past few days had had on him. His life, his career, all the glamour. It all felt insignificant compared to the courage and resilience he'd witnessed in Sonia. And if he could help her in any way, even if it was just with a little pirate magic, he would. When they finally arrived at Sonia's room, they found her resting peacefully, her small form tucked into the hospital bed. The pirate hat was now perched neatly on her head, and in her hand was the golden coin, a symbol of the bravery she had shown. Johnny quietly approached the bed, leaning down to whisper, "Captain Sparrow's still waiting for you, Sonia. Your next adventure is just beginning." He looked over at Miss Abigail, who was standing beside him, tears in her eyes. "She's going to be okay," Johnny said, with a quiet certainty. Miss Abigail nodded, her smile tender but filled with relief. "She is." Miss Abigail looked at Johnny, her expression a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "You mean you want to cover all the expenses for the chemotherapy and radiation?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Johnny nodded, his determination unwavering. "Yes, everything Sonia needs. I don't want her to worry about anything other than getting better. Her focus should be on healing, not the costs of the treatments. I want to make sure she has every opportunity to fight this without any obstacles in her way." Miss Abigail blinked back tears, overwhelmed by his generosity. I don't even know how to thank you, Mr. Depp. This is beyond anything I could have imagined. Sonia deserves a chance at a future, and you're giving her that." Johnny's gaze softened. "No thanks are necessary. Every child deserves a chance to live their dreams, and Sonia has shown more bravery than most adults I know. I just want to make sure she has the best chance possible to keep dreaming." The sincerity in Johnny's voice made Miss Abigail's heart swell with emotion. "We'll take whatever help you can give us. The orphanage. It's not easy for kids like Sonia. But this—" She trailed off, clearly touched by his kindness. "This gives me so much hope." Johnny placed a hand on her shoulder, giving her a reassuring squeeze. "We're in this together. I'll stay involved. Make sure you and Sonia have all the support you need." A few moments later, Sonia stirred again, her eyes fluttering open once more. "Captain Jack," she murmured, her voice still weak but tinged with recognition. Johnny leaned in closer, his face lighting up with warmth. "Right here, first mate," he said with a smile. "You're doing great. Rest now, and when you wake up, we'll start planning our next adventure." Sonia's lips curled into the faintest of smiles, and though she was still groggy, there was a quiet sense of relief in her eyes. She reached out for the golden pirate coin Johnny had given her the night before, clutching it in her hand like a precious treasure. Johnny watched her, feeling a mix of hope and pride. Sonia had fought through so much already, and he knew the real battle was just beginning. But as long as she had the strength to keep going, he would be there, standing by her side, just like a loyal pirate captain. Miss Abigail, who had been watching quietly from the side, came forward and gently took Sonia's hand. "I'm here, sweetheart," she whispered. "And so is Captain Jack. You're not alone." Sonia squeezed her hand weakly, and her eyes closed again, finally surrendering to the exhaustion of the day. Johnny gave her a final glance before turning back to Miss Abigail. "Let's get everything set up for her treatments," he said, his voice firm with resolve. "We'll take it one step at a time, but I want to make sure she has all the support she needs." Miss Abigail nodded, her eyes filled with both gratitude and relief. "I don't know how to express what this means to us. Thank you, Mr. Depp. From the bottom of my heart, thank you." Johnny gave her a soft smile. "You don't need to thank me. We're all in this together. Let's make sure Sonia gets the future she deserves." As Johnny left the recovery room with Miss Abigail, his heart felt lighter than it had in days. He knew the journey ahead would be difficult, but with Sonia's strength and the support he had promised, there was a glimmer of hope on the horizon. And as he walked out into the hallway, the sounds of the hospital fading into the background, Johnny made a silent vow to ensure that Sonia's adventure, her real adventure, would continue. As Johnny finished reading the last lines of the pirate tale, the room was filled with the soft sound of contented sighs. Sonia, propped up against her pillow, looked more at ease than she had in days. Her smile, though small, was genuine, and the laughter of the other children echoed around the room, lifting everyone's spirits. Johnny felt a deep sense of fulfillment, something he hadn't felt in years. It was as though this unexpected journey with Sonia and the other orphans had given him a new perspective on life, one that was about more than fame, more than the next project, and more than the endless stream of work demands. Miss Abigail, sitting on the couch with a hand clasped over her heart, couldn't help but watch Johnny with admiration. She had never imagined that a man so well known, so caught up in the whirlwind of the Hollywood machine, would take such a genuine interest in a group of orphan children. And not just any interest. He was determined to change their lives for the better, starting with Sonia and expanding to everyone who needed help. "Mr. Depp," she began softly as the last of the children whispered their thanks and left, "I can't begin to express how much this means to us." Johnny turned his attention to her, his expression earnest. "This is just the beginning, Miss Abigail. We've got a lot of work ahead, but we're going to do it together. Sonia is just one of many children out there who need help. The orphanage will be better for them, and the clinic. I want it to be a place where they don't just get care, but they get hope. Hope for a future." Tears welled in Miss Abigail's eyes, but she held them back, not wanting to break down in front of him. "I never thought this would be possible. I know it's not easy, but your involvement. This could truly change everything." Johnny gave her a reassuring smile. "I may not know how to handle every challenge, but I'm willing to learn. I have the resources, and now I have the drive to make a real difference." Miss Abigail nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "And you're giving all of this to children who have nothing, to people who have nothing. I can't even begin to understand how much that will mean." Johnny was quiet for a moment, his eyes shifting to Sonia, who was still surrounded by her friends, a picture of peace. "When I look at her and I see the joy on her face, despite everything she's been through, it reminds me of why we're doing this. Every child deserves that joy, that hope, the chance to fight, not just for survival, but for a future." The room fell silent for a moment, each of them absorbed in their thoughts. As the light from the late afternoon sun bathed the room in golden warmth, Johnny stood up and moved closer to Sonia. He gently adjusted the pirate hat on her head, careful not to disturb her resting body. "Sonia," he whispered softly, "how are you feeling?" Her eyes fluttered open, still a little heavy with sleep, but her smile was immediate. "I'm okay, Captain Jack," she mumbled weakly. I think I can get through this." "You will," Johnny promised, leaning down to kiss her forehead gently. "You're one of the bravest pirates I know." Sonia's eyes brightened, a new energy in her gaze despite the weariness that clung to her. "Thank you, Captain." "Any time, First Mate," Johnny replied with a wink, then turned back to Miss Abigail. "Let's keep this momentum going. I'll have my team start drafting the plans for the expansion. I'll personally oversee it. We'll make this place somewhere these children can thrive." Miss Abigail looked at him in awe. "I can't thank you enough, Mr. Depp. I don't think anyone could." "You don't need to," Johnny said, his voice steady but filled with warmth. "This is what I should be doing." As the afternoon light began to dim, casting long shadows across the hospital room. Johnny knew that the road ahead would be anything but easy. But the chance to make a real impact, to give children like Sonia a fighting chance at life, was a mission he was now fully committed to. He would face the challenges head-on, fueled by the courage of a little girl and her dream of a better future. And as he looked around at the children in the room, the bonds of friendship they had forged with Sonia, and the sense of community they were beginning to build, Johnny realized that this had become his new purpose. A new kind of adventure, a life where he wasn't just playing a pirate, but where he could help others live their own adventures. "Let's get started," Johnny said, his voice filled with determination as he stood tall, ready for whatever came next. And with that, he knew that they were all embarking on the most important journey of their lives.